Hello and welcome to Ecoresolution, an environmental justice platform aiming to empower and inspire meaningful action in the face of ecological breakdown through education and a big picture approach to change. Today, we are really excited to be joined by Stephen Corrie, the director of Survival International, a movement of people from over 100 countries. Their vision is a world where tribal peoples are respected as contemporary societies and their human rights protected. Survival International work in partnership with tribal peoples to protect their lives and land as they suffer racism, land theft, forced development, and genocidal violence just because they live differently. Hi, Stephen. Thank you for being here.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Survival International is such an inspiring organization which has been around for over 50 years, I think. I'd love to hear how it came into existence, how it was founded, and kind of the reasons for its existence and how you operate.
Towards the end of the 1960s, some people in mainly England realized that the indigenous peoples of particularly Brazil were under very grave threat. There was road building programs, agricultural expansion into their territory, and a very violent frontier was opening up, including with people getting shot, people having dynamite sticks thrown out of airplanes at their communities. So it really was a genocidal situation. And they decided, just a group of people who had traveled there, some anthropologists, that something ought to be done about this, so that an organization should be founded to try and do something about it. Nobody quite knew what, but in those days. So that's how it started at the end of the 60s. And it's developed since then.
And can you tell me about the kind of the dire consequences or situations which indigenous communities around the world are being faced with currently?
The fundamental problem has always been the same, and it boils down to land theft, land encroachment. Where these peoples are enabled to have and retain their lands, by and large, most of the other problems disappear. I mean, there are other issues, health issues, particularly nowadays, and so on and so forth. But the real key to everything has always been land. That was realized by survival right at the beginning, and it's still the case. It's a land invasion.
And so do you work in partnership with these people to help maintain their land? Do you have to then get involved in like the legal side? What are the kind of processes that Survival International are involved with?
Well, should I perhaps first say something about the terminology, because it pertains to your question?
Yes, thank you.
There is a very broad spectrum of which is now encompassed by the term indigenous, and it ranges from everything from uncontacted tribal peoples in Amazonia and some other places, all the way through to well-paid New York lawyers who are of indigenous descent. Survival had always existed for the first part of the spectrum. That's to say, people who are less in contact with the outside world, which is one reason why I've used the word tribal, which I can come back to. But what that means is that if one of our key primary focuses is uncontacted peoples, which it is, then obviously it's not a question of partnership. It is a question of trying to put up barriers against the invasion of their land. So in one way, yes, we're working in partnership with literally hundreds of indigenous communities all around the world. On the other hand, what we really are doing is trying to stand up to the crimes being committed by our society and trying to stop them. So in no way do we claim to represent these people or even to represent their rights. We're trying to hold our own society to account and stop it doing what it's doing. I could say a bit more about the tribal definition, if you like.
Yes, please.
There's no, all terminology referring to human groups is flawed. It's extremely complicated and difficult. What's a Scotsman, for example? That's the first thing. The second thing is that the word tribal, generally speaking, is a more vernacular word, more understood in the English language, particularly by not necessarily native English speakers, than the word indigenous, which is a bit techie, although becoming less so. But there are other very important differences. There is a difference between tribal and indigenous. If you like, the word indigenous really refers to who people are, mainly their descent. The word tribal mainly refers to how they live. And that is the case also in the only international law, which is about both tribal and indigenous peoples, which distinguishes between the two terms. The idea now that tribal is a kind of word which shouldn't be used in polite society is relatively new, and these things come and go with fashion. So the reason why survival uses tribal, sometimes interchangeably with indigenous, is to try to distinguish that it is not looking at the total spectrum of the indigenous issue, if you like. It's trying to keep its focus on a particular end of it. And the reason for that is we think these are the peoples who stand to lose most from the crimes being committed against them, fundamentally by our society.
Thank you for that clarification. It's really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it like that. I was reading some of the work of Survival International, and I found one particular quote that I found really interesting because of how it highlights these themes of progress and development that I always find very frustrating. I'll read it out. It says, tribal peoples number some 200 million, just 4% of the world's population. Too often treated as obstacles to progress, objects of study, the exotic showpieces of tourism, or potential converts to another religion, they are in fact members of complex and viable societies with a sense of purpose, fulfillment, and community that many in our modern societies might envy. Their apparently simple technology enables them to live well in supposedly inhospitable areas, which defeat our own, quotation marks, high technology. Meanwhile, we make deserts of their homeland and call it development. And I find this so interesting because I just find, the idea that we have advanced economies which completely fail and systematically to operate in balance with the living world, and then kind of say we have developed cultures, and yet we face incomprehensible mental health crises, addictions to consumerism, polarization, climate emergency, the list goes on. I just, the concept of progress versus and development versus more tribal ways or indigenous or natural ways of living, very frustrating. What do you think is stopping, or how do you think maybe we can shift cultural narratives so around these ideas of progress, to understand that any truly developed society can't call itself developed unless not only are the people well and happy, ideally, but also that they kind of live alongside the ecosystems that support them?
Yes, that's a good question. The idea of progress, as it's pushed by the West or the global North, or however you like to define it, is actually a relatively recent idea historically. It's only been around for a few centuries. Many peoples see history in as much that they would have a record of history going back more than, say, 6 or 7 generations. They would see it as much more cyclic. There's not a linear sort of escalator which is ever getting better and leading societies to something which is better or more fulfilled. as I say, it's a recent idea. It's an extremely damaging idea. It's the idea which underpins colonialism, racism, and a lot of these things. And I think there are a lot of people now who are figuring out that there's something deeply flawed with this ideology. And it's a belief. It's like a religious belief. And in some ways, it is actually a religious belief. And I think it's extremely important that it's continually challenged and overturned. One of the problems is that the development is still taught as basically Western development. There's all kinds of things wrong with the way environmentalism is taught and conservation is taught. And all these things are rooted in basically a colonial approach, which says that the global north, what used to be called the Western world, has the answers and the rest of the world doesn't. So if you talk about progress to, I don't know, an East African herder, Maasai, for instance, or an Amazonian tribal person, many of them are likely to listen and not be particularly convinced, to be honest, which isn't to say that the technological advancements, which undoubtedly are technological advancements, are useful, and they are adopted by tribal peoples just as much as by anybody else. So nobody is saying, you know, that technological advances are necessarily inherently bad. The problem is the ideology underlying it, and the way the idea that the Western world can and indeed should dominate, and that its ideas should dominate. That is the problem, and of course is also part of the origin of colonialism and racism and all the rest.
And it kind of gives this like cultural validation or excuse to like the damage which has been created to the natural world by the idea of anything in the name of the progress of our economy and the growth of economy and the growth of production and the growth of consumption, to the point where it's like the effects of the economic system don't matter so long as the economy is growing every year, and we still measure our progress by GDP, which is I actually think quite psychotic when we take everything into consideration and have a bigger picture understanding of where we are in the world right now. And but I think also I really love to think about, you know, the issues we face, but also kind of the visions of the future and where we could lead, where we could be going to, as kind of really thinking about what narratives and stories are driving us. And I really think that this narrative of progress and of development has led us so much of where we are now is because of this idea. And I really hope that we can kind of come to our senses and start to reimagine what progress, or maybe just do away with the word, but just kind of how we can evolve, you know, in line with the resilience of communities and thriving ecosystems, and perhaps start to see well-being and human happiness and equality and freedom and justice as being like the kind of markers of progress and development, or maybe just evolution rather than economic growth. And I think when we look back in history, you know, in some generations to come, I hope that they can kind of laugh at, you know, this kind of ridiculous idea and conception of progress today, because it's just very ironic and strange. I think at the moment, one of the greatest questions of our time is how we can face the reality of the climate and ecological crisis, and not just fight it, but create cultures that are socially just and kind of and that are in line with ecosystems. And for leaders, it seems a little bit more like, how can we mitigate climate change without actually having to change anything or undermine the sacred growth economy? And I think that's making quite a lot of scary things occur for me at the moment, where I'm seeing a lot of initiatives that seem like they're kind of environmental and they're being pushed by the government, but actually they are the opposite of it. But they've kind of got this greenwashing idea, a bit like the whole carbon narrative and carbon trading, which I find quite scary, because it seems like more of the same. And I know that this is definitely the case with a lot of conservation efforts, and I'd love to ask you about this. I watched a video on survival by a man called Yannick of the Maasai people in Tanzania, and he said the biggest source of injustice of indigenous communities is coming from conservation authorities of protected lands. These lands are the original lands of indigenous communities. The protected areas have been established in a way that perpetuates a colonial mentality and attitude, and the people have been pushed away from their lands, and then the parks are created. And he goes on to say that this has created a lot of animosity and the continuation of indigenous rights being undermined. Could you tell me a little bit about this, and what are the efforts behind this big push for protected areas?
Yes, well, if I start where you started, which is the sort of gradual dawning of the fact that progress is flawed, and the idea of endless progress is very damaging. Of course, it's not the first time people have begun to think that. And there was a very strong movement towards thinking that 50 years ago or 60 years ago, in the late 60s and early 70s. And what I think happened then is that the corporates are extremely clever and good at manipulating the agenda for profit, basically. So whilst, if you go back 50 years, a lot of people thought, well, actually, where we can build a newer and better world, what happens then is the corporations come along and say, yes, we want a newer and better world, and we're going to really push for this, and it involves you buying more of our stuff. Now, in a way, the conservation issue is very similar. Conservation starts 150 years ago in the United States with the National Park movement. This was a time of what are generally called the Indian Wars. And the idea of the national parks was partly to get the Native Americans off their land, push them into reservations, or destroy them. That idea that the protected areas should exclude the local people is deeply embedded in the national park idea. It's deeply embedded in conservation thinking. So in a continent like Africa, where you had the first national park starting in about the 1920s by Americans with exactly the same ideology. Some of them were big game hunters. Many of them were big game hunters, actually, the people behind the early conservation movement. And they wanted local people to stop hunting so that they could have the herds, the trophy animals for themselves. But that's another side of the story. The African story is one of land theft, of excluding people, of kicking them off their land. And it's still going on today in Africa and parts of Asia, but pretty much exactly as it always has. So many of the local peoples are seeing this basically as colonialism. They see the conservation, which is generally run by white people, as just another colonial land grab. And the objective is to get them off their land. The idea of the conservationists is to create an artificial sort of wilderness. None of these areas are actually wilderness in any sense of the word. And so what they actually end up creating is a kind of theme park for tourists. And that is generally the case with protected areas in, as I say, Africa and parts of Asia, and indeed in North America, where the same history happened over 100 years ago. So there's a very, it's the same ideological problem with conservation as with progress. It stems from the idea that nature, in inverted commas, and often written with a capital N, is separate from people, and nature is considered basically divine. If you look at the early conservationists, there's frequent calls to religious language. Nature is seen as divine, and humanity is seen as evil, fallen, and that is still very widespread. You look at social media accounts, you see terms like overpopulation, humanity is a plague upon the earth, all this stuff, which basically lays the blame for environmental destruction at the foot of humanity, when in fact, the environmental destruction is caused by a very tiny sector of humanity, and particularly the richest, whose carbon footprints are several hundred times higher than any African, and actually often several hundred times higher than most Europeans. So there's deep within the ideological narrative, there's this problem. Unless we can get rid of this problem, it will basically end up destroying an awful lot more, including destroying the environment, because the issue is not phrased in the way it should be, which is let's consume less. We have to consume less, and the biggest consumers particularly have to consume less. The biggest users of carbon in the world, I think the single biggest user is the US Department of Defense. And of course, armaments and armed conflict you create a huge amount of pollution. This is hardly ever mentioned in the climate narrative, and we're told that, you know, if we don't drink through plastic straws or recycle the tins, then we're doing our bit, and in fact that's part of the problem. And we're told this fundamentally by big conservation organizations which are partnering with big corporations, often fossil fuel and other exploitive corporations, which are supported by governments, which also want the GDP up because it means basically more money. So the axis, there's an axis between government, big NGOs, not just conservation NGOs, but big NGOs, government, big foundations, and big corporations, who are fundamentally the same people. There's a revolving door going through it. You look at the bosses of many of the big conservation NGOs, they're formerly bankers, or they used to work with some extractive industry or other. So basically, the public's view of this is the public are being conned, to put it bluntly. We are being fed a constant stream of extremely expensive propaganda from the BBC and its natural history programs, which have been churning out the same thing for 60 years. We're fed a constant stream of propaganda, which is fundamentally flawed about environmental issues. And if that isn't corrected, there won't be any protected areas at all, because local people are increasingly getting very angry about this. The conservation NGOs now want to make 30% of the globe into protected areas. That will involve the eviction, if it happens, the eviction of hundreds of millions of people, more people. It will create more starvation, more dispossession, more slums, bigger slums, and the people actually won't stand for it. So in places like Africa, you have people going into these conservation areas, cutting the fences, going back in. Some of the so-called poaching in Africa is actually retaliation against the protected areas. It's a deliberate going in and killing. of animals because they hate the conservation industry so much. And unless that's corrected, basically the protected areas are finished. So the move to now increase them, double them in size with huge amounts of taxpayers' money, billions of dollars of taxpayers' money thrown behind it, will actually undo, the whole thing will start to unravel.
It's
so it has to.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, and I mean, I think of myself as being like not that well versed, but quite well versed on like environmental matters. And before I watched an interview that you did with XR, it was just something I never really thought about. So if I'd heard, I actually hadn't heard about the protected areas kind of push, but if I had heard, I would have thought, oh, how amazing, that's good. And then like it just goes to show how, I mean, that was maybe silly of me to not thought deeper about it, but it does go to show how complex and nuanced the issues that we are faced with. And if we're not changing the narrative and having deeper responses to the crises of our time, it's just going to be more of the same. More separation of people from nature, more colonial and imperialist ideas, more racism, more injustice, less freedom, more surveillance. It's just more of the things which have gotten us to this place in the first place. And I really love how you spoke about kind of this idea of nature and the separation of humans from nature, and this idea that it's humans who are the virus, and it's not. And I think we get this we're really led astray when we start to think that in essence humans are bad and can't live in harmony with nature. Like, we are nature. Of course we can live in harmony with nature, and tribal peoples and indigenous communities go to show that, because that's, you know, some of the most ancient ways of living with the land, and their communities have survived, and they've survived the test of time, and they're still functioning and harmonious. I mean, not to over romanticize communities, I'm sure they have their own issues within them as well, of course, but by and large they're doing a lot better than we are when we think about, you know, the damage and destruction that we're causing. By we, I mean at least my country that I'm from, the UK. And this is also something that I think a little bit about when I hear, you know, ideas about rewilding. So something in my own country, when people talk about get everyone off the land, get farmers off the land, we'll make all the food in industrialized complexes and rewild the whole of the UK. And I've got a lot of family who are farmers in the UK, and they're just furious. And it just makes so much polarization within the environmental movement, and it kind of makes, you know, environmentalists look like these armchair environmentalists who are sitting in London and saying what people in the countryside need to be doing, when actually it's like often the urban, corporate, very wealthy ways of life which are causing the destruction, not the people who are living on the land and living pretty harmoniously with them. And, you know, same with the big push about veganism. Of course, having a plant-based diet is amazing, but actually a lot of people need the meat, and also having ruminants, having animals that graze on land is very important for regenerative cycles of farming. And it's just when we try and simplify things and say, right, humans are the problem, we're going to go over there so we can continue going in this very destructive, unjust, completely ridiculous direction, and we're going to let nature do its thing over there. It just is never going to work. We need to completely re-envisage how we live in harmony with our ecosystems, and that to me is the most exciting thing, and the reason why I do what I do, because I think that's a really wonderful way to invest my time and energy, seeing as I can do that. I'd love to. And one more thing, I watched the David Attenborough documentary, which I loved. And then also it was bittersweet, because when in the solutions part, the music was changing, it was all getting exciting. And I was like, yes, they're going to show all the amazing things that we can do. And it was population. Of course, population is an issue, but only, well, majoritarily because of consumption. And then it was all these pictures of food being grown indoors. And it's like, we should be able to farm regeneratively, and small farms of the future, not these big corporate kind of industrialized complexes of growing inside that's only going to give more to corporate power. So like for me, you know, we are not the virus. It's corporate globalization, it's the growth-based economy, it's the ideology of human separation from nature, not being intrinsically a part of it, and with a duty to uphold our small part of this complex web of life. It's so frustrating. I'd love to ask though, so all this money being pushed into protected areas, where would you like to see that money going to? Because we do need to, something needs to happen, and where would you put that money and those resources rather than pushing people off the land?
Well, it's extremely simple and very much cheaper. What the conservation NGOs should do, if they actually wanted to do conservation rather than what they see as this increasing separation of human beings from nature, is to approach local people and say to them, look, we have resources, and of course they have thousands of millions. Do you want us to help you protect your land for you? And if so, how can we do that? And to actually just invert the power balance and put local people into the driving seat. I've put that to people who've followed very closely the conservation industry for a very long time, and I generally get exactly the same response, which is that is the last thing they will agree to, because what they want is the money and the control. And if they get the money to do protected areas, they can do deals with selling carbon credit. They get huge amounts of taxpayers' money. Their organizations grow bigger. Their propaganda machine grows bigger. They can fool more people, basically. And when you watched your Attenborough program, hopefully, and were then disappointed, that's what we're up against. We're up against a truly massive propaganda machine. The idea of separation of human being from nature comes around the same time in the history of ideas as the idea of progress, and it comes from basically the same place. It's fundamentally it's a belief, not a science. You could even say it's a religious belief. I think it is a religious belief, actually, very close to it. So what could and should be happening is that in indigenous and other local people's lands, and particularly in areas where there is where they are close to self-sufficiency economically, should be protected for them, and them put in control. Their land rights, which are supposedly there under international law, they're supposed to have ownership rights over this land. That's ignored by the conservationists. Those land rights should be upheld. So the funds, which need be, 1% of what is currently spent only, should go into helping them protect their land. Already 80%, it's reckoned, of biodiversity. It's a complex number. How do you get that number? But that's what people are saying now. About 80% of biodiversity is found on indigenous people's lands. They are much better at this than protected areas. They're much better at this than Western conservationists or conservation zones. So that should be encouraged. At the moment, exactly the reverse is happening, and they're still being thrown out. So when you say you have farming relatives who are getting angry about the rewilding, what they're beginning to see is something of what people in Africa have seen for 100 years. That is, conservationists who generally are urban, college educated, often from another country. If you talk to Welsh shepherds, for instance, these people are perceived as part of English colonialism, which is how Africans see conservationists. So the colonial enterprise is alive and well. Of course, if you have all the food grown indoors by corporations, you then basically control the entire population. Whoever controls the food supply controls the people. You can change your prices as you like. You can sap people's energy by increasing the prices so they can get less access to food. Already we're hearing things like the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is an enormous American organization, saying that all Africans should eat chicken and or farmed fish. So there are millions of Africans, hundreds of millions of Africans who depend on pastoralism, moving herds, camels, cows, sheep, goats over big distances, highly adaptable, resilient societies. It doesn't rain in one place, you move to another place, which have been going on for thousands of years. That self-sufficiency is being eroded by this narrative. And it's dangerous for them. It's dangerous for everybody, actually, because locally produced food is, in the event of you really want to use no carbon, then you're going to have to depend on food grown fairly near where you live, grown in some way or other on the hoof or in the field. So there's all kinds of contradictions in this extremely damaging narrative. We want to bring back more self-sufficiency. The corporations don't want people to be self-sufficient. They want people to be dependent on them and on their goods and on their, whether it's food or whether it's tech, gadgets, and so on and so forth. They want people buying this stuff. That's why you have built-in obsolescence. So you have to buy another one in 2 or 3 years because it doesn't work anymore. So it's a constant, the money is constantly filtering up and the resources are filtering up. At the same time, huge numbers of people in the world actually do still live, to a large extent, pretty self-sufficiently, obviously less so in Europe. And the West, and there where we should be looking for solutions and to ways out of this. But the number of people saying the kind of things I'm saying, and I'm well aware that if I was to go through the history of conservation, for instance, a lot of people would think I was completely mad. It starts with trophy hunters. It's to do with evicting people. It's to do with getting people off the land that those people were managing and landscaping and tending and turning those lands into something which is untended, but is actually there for a theme park. So you can put in hotels, you can put in roads, you can put in airstrips, all the rest of it. Meanwhile, you've kicked the people off who were living off and from the land and actually understood it. These are deep problems, deep-seated beliefs. Until and unless people start talking about them, things are not going to change.
Yeah, we're going to be releasing this interview within the context of ecosystem restoration, which is one of our themes that we're looking at this year. And I wanted to be really clear that ecosystem restoration isn't something that we should add on to like the ends of our activities, but that humans can live in a way which is constantly restoring ecosystems. And going back to that idea of humanity as a virus, it isn't that way, and it's not that way for a lot of the people who do live self-sufficiently. And I was reading one of your articles called "The Best Conservationists Made Our Environment and Can Save It," and it talks about how tribal peoples in the Amazon created very fertile patches where food could be grown in kind of more like localized areas. And I just think that's a really kind of interesting point to highlight, that that we need to shift our whole way of living and not be relying on corporations that are causing so much destruction, and start to see how we can become more self-sufficient, how we can support local initiatives. And I'd also love to ask, beyond paying lip service to being in solidarity with tribal peoples and indigenous communities, how can organizations such as Ecoresolution, but also like me as an individual and listeners, like really stand in solidarity and kind of take action and support Survival International and the work that you do?
Well, I think people who feel deeply about this should be challenging the narrative. I think it's absolutely vital that this narrative is, the wrong narrative we've been talking about is challenged, openly challenged, and repeatedly openly challenged. When we started attacking the big conservation industry, I now call it a mafia. It's a conservation mafia. When we started attacking it, we've been raising issues with it for 30 years or more, but we really started more in earnest 6 or 7 years ago. A lot of people come out and say they agree with us, including people working for these organizations or who have worked for these organizations. They can't say anything because this mafia has such a stranglehold over the jobs, over the funding, that if you challenge the narrative, you don't get a job, or you don't get another job, and you don't get published. So there's a massive wall of silence, complicity around this destructive narrative. Unless people begin to challenge it openly and say what they think, things are not going to change. There's got to be a movement coming from a lot of people calling for this kind of real change. As I said earlier, the corporate world is very smart, and it spends a lot of time thinking about how to divert the criticism. It goes through a series of categories. Initially, denial, denies there's any problem. It was the same with cigarettes and cancer. Initially, there's denial. Then there's a long period, decades of arguing over the science, with huge amount of money put into scientists who are going to say what the corporates want them to say. And then eventually something starts getting through, so the corporation switches to doing something else. It's to a certain extent always one step ahead of the game, because they are generally better organized than people like us. They have more resources and all the rest of it. I have a very great respect for the corporate world, actually. It's very clever. Unless people are actually openly challenging this narrative, it won't change. And that means people starting to talk about it and calling it out for what it is, without being afraid of the consequences, without subduing the language to make it sound more reasonable. What's going on is not reasonable. What's going on is a massive onslaught to millions of people. At least 10, 15, probably far more million people have been evicted and dispossessed by conservation so far. The plan that's on the table now will dispossess another several hundred million. 300 million is the number that is being talked about, which will be a complete disaster. So this is money which will be sucked out of climate activism, for instance, and put into protected areas, because that's supposed to help the climate. It won't help the climate. It's now supposed to help combat pandemics. It won't help combat pandemics, if anything, the reverse, because it just pushes more people into more overcrowded slums. So the narrative is completely the opposite of what should be going on. And it's so big, it's such a big lie, and it's been told for so long that it is difficult to challenge it. And as I say, if I went through the history of the conservation movement, from my perspective, most people would think he's crazy. It's not possible You know, there's a link between conservation, eugenics, the Nazi movement. All these things are coming from basically the same ideology, and are very intimately connected if you go back 100 years or more. And you can see this, how this history is unfurling. It sounds crazy. If you put it like that, it sounds crazy. So this narrative has to be unpicked. It has to be challenged robustly in a way which is going to reach ordinary people. I think that's the key thing people can do. Talk about it.
Yeah, and
raise the question, challenge.
I think like what's coming up for me when you say that as well is just this thing of like, we need deeper responses. And whilst yes, we're facing a crisis, that doesn't mean that we need to have these kind of huge policies that aren't that don't take into consideration the effects of them, that kind of look good on the tin, but when they're rolled out, they have like terrible repercussions. And we kind of just need to slow down. If we could slow down the economy, slow down consumerism and production, and start to look deeply at how we can make change. But also, I think the other thing is it's so easy to point the finger, and I just find it bizarre that these conservation organizations that are kind of based in the States or based in the UK, their headquarters, can then look to Africa and kind of think that Africa can be their playground in which to try out these different environmental initiatives. And it's constant, but we see it within ourselves as well. You know, we kind of point the finger at our governments for not doing the things that we want them to do, whilst our lives are in complete misalignment with the kind of world that we want to be living in. You know, and it's kind of thinking about like what we're practicing on the small scale and how that's setting the pattern for the bigger system. And I just think we need like a big dose of humility and to slow down and to think really deeply. I think, you know, this idea of conservation as well, like you said before, is so clearly interlinked with this idea of progress. It's kind of constantly trying to push ahead the next thing, rather than taking into consideration the damage which has already been done, and trying to slow down and not continue with these outrageous imperialistic approaches to supposed solutions, but actually just perpetrate the same oppressive systems that got us here in the first place.
Yeah, different people have different capacities and characters, of course. The problem with simply slowing down is that it actually could play right into the hands of the corporations, because what they don't want is a vigorous pushback. Some people, for whatever reason, in my case, because I've been immensely lucky and privileged, I think luck is a better word actually myself, and been able to fight these things from a position of comfort. I don't fear somebody knocking at the door at 4 o'clock in the morning and hauling me off yet, anyway. It might still happen. So that luck has enabled me to be able to actively fight this, and I think we need more people fighting. We need more people shouting, and more people pointing the finger, actually, but pointing it in the right place. So it works differently for different people, and there's nothing wrong, obviously, with a kind of, you know, withdraw and look to your own garden approach. And indeed, a lot of people do that. I think more people do that than we think, or that we hear about, because they're not visible. They kind of go off grid in some way or other. And there are a lot of people who live largely or partly off grid, sometimes not out of choice, but also sometimes out of choice. But then they kind of disappear from the crazy media narrative, so their voices are not heard. So we need people also within that crazy media narrative, calling things out for what they are, pointing out what's wrong, pointing out the lies that are being told, or the lies will just continue to be told. So I think it's great to, you know, look to one's own garden and things. And I'm all for it. But I think we also need to encourage people to take a strident approach and start challenging these people and ideas who are getting richer and richer and consuming more and more and more.
Yeah.
Basically at our expense, at the world's expense, and are getting away with it. And nowadays are painting themselves as green.
Being celebrated.
Being celebrated.
They're being celebrated.
Yes,
yeah.
Being celebrated.
Next year, Ecoresolution wants to be focusing in on these kind of aspects, like the kind of like trying to hold a bit more complexity in some of the supposed solutions to the environmental crisis, because I think everyone's so worried about overwhelming people, but actually I think that you can't be. We just have to embrace the complexity of it, and I hope Ecoresolution can really platform this really important knowledge and wisdom that you've shared with us today.
Well, I'm actually an optimist.
Yeah, good. Tell me what makes you optimistic.
I do believe in the resilience of humanity, and in that it is fundamentally good, and that people will increasingly see through this, and will increasingly stop the people who are destroying the world and people from doing so. I think there's always going to be a tussle, but I do not, I wouldn't predict what's going to happen, because all the major things that have happened, nobody predicted. The wars, 9/11, etc., etc. So I wouldn't predict, but I am certainly an optimist, and I believe that people's adaptability, resilience is very evident, and the thing which eventually has to come to the fore.
Yeah, I agree. Stephen, thank you so much for your time, and for everyone listening, please go to the Survival International website and have an explore. It's a brilliant website with loads of interesting articles and places to donate and things to learn, and also take Stephen's advice and let's start talking and communicating about the complexities and also just completely bizarre and wrong thinking behind these big pushes for protected areas. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.